Before anyone gets too excited in the comments, this isn't a video about the merits or drawbacks of nuclear power. If that's what you're after, then you'll probably need a different video. What we are here to talk about today is the fascinating history of how Melbourne and Victoria very nearly got our own nuclear power stations. If you're new here, my name is Philip Mallis, and I make videos about local history, and I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. Every little bit helps. Our story begins in 1955 when Henry Bolte became Premier of Victoria. He would go on to become the longest serving Premier in the state's history, serving for 17 consecutive years. Not long into his second term, his government started thinking about nuclear energy. This was because at the time, atomic fever had spread across the world, with many believing that it would be the answer to many of the world's pressing issues. Most famously, both the United States and Soviet Union developed programs planning to use nuclear bombs for large-scale construction of things like dams, canals, and mines. The main programs were called Operation Plowshare and the very descriptive nuclear explosions for the national economy, respectively. Most countries just stuck to nuclear power though. So with this background, in 1967, the Victorian Ministry of Fuel and Power started planning for nuclear electricity generation. They initially planned for the first power station to be operational by the early 1980s. But this wasn't publicly confirmed until December 1968, because this was when the government released a huge new development scheme to transform the entire area of Westernport, to which this first proposal for a nuclear power station became intrinsically linked. If you're not familiar with Westernport, it's a large, shallow bay to the southeast of Melbourne with two main islands, Phillip Island and French Island. It has several towns around its coast, including Crib Point, San Remo and Cowes. It's very ecologically significant, especially for birds and marine life, perhaps most famously for little penguins and Australian fur seals. Most relevant to this topic though is the industrial facilities around the bay. These are fairly recent and mainly centred on the west coast near Hastings and Crib Point. Any Gunzels watching will likely already be familiar with one of the largest of these, the BlueScope Steel Mill at Hastings, which the Long Island Steel Train services. I'll probably have to do a separate video on this development plan one day, but to summarise, the scheme involved a massive expansion of this industry. It included factories, a new deep water shipping channel, and even a hovercraft service of all things, because this was the 1970s, so why not? But the centrepiece of all of this was to be a nuclear power station on the southeast coast of French Island to power the lot. As soon as this grand new master plan was announced, it immediately started a rush on property that spiked land prices and had everyone scrambling to buy in the area to get a piece of the action. These included Commonwealth Industrial Gases, transport company Main Nicholas, and the Gas and Fuel Corporation. But the biggest buyer of all was BHP, which purchased over 2,700 acres of land near Hastings and on French Island itself. This was reportedly to build a new steel plant or facility similar to Port Kembla in New South Wales. But the one that concerns us the most here is the State Electricity Commission, or SEC, who will become a very important player in this story. They bought 3 bits of land, 2 making up a combined 650 acres on French Island and a single 50-acre site at Tyabb. All 3 parcels of land were earmarked for power stations. At the time, the SEC left its options open for oil, gas or nuclear energy. But soon, from statements made by its senior executives and its own reports, it was clear that nuclear was the SEC's preferred option, and officials drew up plans to start building it in 1976 and have it fully operational by 1985. This new source of energy would provide more than enough electricity for all of the energy-hungry industrial uses, and also allow for a new satellite city of up to 50,000 people to be built right next to Melbourne, with this being dubbed a second Wollongong. This was all against the backdrop of a Commonwealth government plan at the time to build its own nuclear power station at Jervis Bay, for both electricity generation and possible defence purposes. At the urging of pro-nuclear Prime Minister John Gorton, they established the National Consultative Committee on Nuclear Energy in 1969 to set up a framework for states and territories to implement nuclear power. In charge of all this activity at Westernport was a new organisation with the power to make the calls, the Mornington and Westernport Regional Planning Authority. Although it reported to the Town and Country Planning Board and the Minister for Local Government, it brought together the 6 councils in the area and had quite a lot of authority. All of this grand planning obviously generated a lot of interest, and it looked set to be one of the biggest infrastructure projects in the state's history. But a sudden change in the political landscape was all that it took for these dreams to be dashed. On the 23rd of August 1972, Henry Bolte resigned and Rupert Dick Hamer became the new Premier of Victoria, quickly spelling the end of the entire scheme less than 4 years after it was announced. This was because soon after his elevation to the leadership, the new Premier announced in 1974 that the state government had no plans to build a nuclear power station in Victoria, and that the land bought on French Island was, quote, precautionary. Without the guarantee of the electricity that they needed, the entire Westernport development plan went quiet. In 1976, the companies who had bought land on French Island were told that it could no longer be used for industrial purposes, and almost half the island was declared a state park in 1978. But the SEC were not about to give up their dream of a nuclear power station so quickly. But having well and truly scorched the earth with their French Island proposal, they now needed to find another site. All was relatively quiet until 1979, when it came up again during a meeting between the SEC and the Australian Atomic Energy Commission. After this, the SEC commissioned a report in February 1980 by British Electricity International. Its main job was to examine the theoretical feasibility of nuclear power in Victoria. In their 1979 to 1980 annual report, the SEC stated that from their point of view, nuclear power was the only viable alternative to brown coal electricity generation for the foreseeable future, and presumably they wanted to test this hypothesis. But first, they had to find a suitable location for this nuclear power plant. They considered at least 11 possible sites: Kirk Point, south of Werribee; Breamley near Torquay on the south coast; Stony Point in Westernport; French Island again; Powlett River in South Gippsland; Corner Inlet north of Wilson's Promontory; Giffard south of Sale in Gippsland, and I hope I pronounced that correctly; Cape Riamure near Port Fairy; Princetown and Glenair near Cape Otway; and Tyrandurra just north of Portland in Western Victoria. These reports were never fully published, and I couldn't find any copies for research. And although the British Electricity International report found that the overall cost of nuclear would be at least twice that of conventional brown coal, it was still used by the state government to justify its decision in 1984 that a nuclear power plant would be built in Portland, a coastal town in the southwest of Victoria. This site was chosen mainly because Alcoa, a large US-based industrial company, had proposed and sought approval for an aluminium smelter complex and supporting infrastructure, capable of producing over 530,000 tonnes of aluminium every year, and had signed an agreement with the state government to this effect, which guaranteed them sufficient electricity supply. Now, these smelters use a massive amount of electricity, so building a nuclear power station next door was seen as a good co-location with the plant to avoid straining the state's already struggling power grid. Now, as you can imagine, this proposal sparked a lot of media attention and community opposition, both locally and further afield. Many people living in these places were not great fans of having a nuclear power station in the vicinity, and they organised protests, petitions, and other activism against the proposals. People quickly organised against both the smelter and the nuclear plant. There were not only environmental concerns about the plant itself, but also the prospects of higher energy prices for the entire state. This was also during one of the most tense periods of the Cold War, when the threat of global nuclear destruction was at one of its highest points of public attention. But all of this came to an abrupt halt in 1983, because this was when the Victorian Parliament passed the Nuclear Activities Prohibitions Act. As you might have guessed from the name, this Act of Parliament specifically prohibits the development of nuclear power anywhere in the state and is still in force today. And so that spelled the end of the 2 most advanced proposals for nuclear power generation in Victoria to date. Don't get confused, by the way, between this proposal and the French Island power station that does actually exist, although it's not nuclear but powered by waste instead. Plus, it's also located on the other side of the world in the United States. If you go down to our own French island today, there is certainly no hovercraft plying the seas between Stony Point and the two islands. The only physical things that were built as part of the Westernport development scheme, as far as I can tell, were some upgraded jetties and wharves, and this 66,000 volt substation in Hastings, which was built in anticipation of the power station and is still in use today. Interestingly, even after a nuclear power plant on French Island was ruled out in 1974, the Mornington and Westernport Regional Planning Authority still recommended that the SEC keep its site on French Island for, quote, a possible future thermal power site. This never eventuated, and the SEC continued to lease it out for farming and grazing. French Island even came up again as the site for a third airport by the Commonwealth Government in the 1970s, but this was also discounted and didn't proceed. Proposals for nuclear power in Victoria do pop up every now and again, including in 2006 by the federal government and in 2016, both for Portland again. And still others for places in the Latrobe Valley as recently as 2024. Whether this cancellation was a good or bad thing is a matter of opinion, but I was genuinely surprised when I was researching this video just how far the plans got and how close this came to being built in some form. If Victoria did get a nuclear power station, then I think our state would look very different. It would have likely had national implications as well, by setting a precedent for atomic energy in Australia, especially after the plans for a nuclear power station in Jervis Bay were abandoned in 1971. But in any case, none of these ever progressed beyond planning and designs. But if they had, there are likely many things that would have changed. Thanks for watching. Again, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It really helps and you get notified directly whenever I release a new video, as well as any other channel updates. You can also check out my supporters portal at members.philipmallis.com. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.